This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Herbie Hancock, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Sextant. This album was Hancock's debut for Columbia Records and features an impressionistic post-modal jazz theme. There's 3 long tracks on the album, each featuring some great solos and improvisation. The next album is called Headhunters. This album spans a vast series of genres and cultures. The album spent 42 weeks on the Billboard charts upon release and became the first ever platinum-selling jazz album. The themes in the album span funk, soul and R&B. At an album called Inventions and Dimensions. This album was a departure from the norm. In this album, we see Hancock alongside a small ensemble performing some great Latin theme songs. The music has a lot of improvisation and has a dance track feel to it. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Herbie Hancock, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Sextant, released in 1973. Herbie Hancock was a big fan of experimentation. For example, when synthesizers became mainstream, he used them to increase his scope as a keyboardist. Many instances of these experimental new sounds would soon be apparent in later albums like The Headhunters. In 1973, Herbie Hancock did something else. He formed a new group under a Swahili-inspired name, Muandishi. This band combined more modern instruments like the clavinet and the synth with traditional jazz instruments like the sax and trombone and trumpet. They recorded several albums together like Crossings in 1972. Sextant is another album that showcases Herbie Hancock's experimentations with the fusion of mainstream and modern jazz. The opening track, Rain Dance, bristles with electric energy, especially on the solos. There's elements of electronica and ambience in a backdrop of jazz. Hidden Shadows is the next track. This one features keyboard and brass solos in a backdrop of bass grooves. The next song is called Hornets. This song sees the appearance of ARP synthesizer music. The percussion enters with synths and clavinets working their way around an Afro-funk groove. This album was similar to several Miles Davis albums that received mixed reactions from critics at the time, but today this is a classic album. Today the album is renowned as one of the pioneering albums in the use of ambience and electronics, as well as Afro-funk rhythms and improvisation. Another album called Headhunters, released in 1973. This was one of the most influential jazz albums of all time. Upon its release, it topped the charts and went on to pave the way for hip-hop and electronic music. Collaborating with Hancock on this album are a stellar lineup, from percussionist Bill Summers to drummer Harvey Mason. Incidentally, this album, which was his second release on Columbia Records, went on to become one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time when it hit the charts in 1973. The opening track, Chameleon, is a 16-minute ride of jazz fusion, overlapping various overtones. The classic Watermelon Man is covered as a pure funky jazz song. The song plays out with a more tropical feel than the original, supplemented by shimmering flute melodies and a guitar backdrop. The original song is an acoustic ensemble piece. In this album, it plays out like a jam session with a lot of improvisation. Another great funk-oriented improvisation piece is the song Sly. There's rapid-paced percussion drum beats in this song. The closing track is more relaxed, a piece called Vein Melter. It's a gentle, frolicking song combining soft keyboard music with dreamy saxophone melodies. Headhunters was a very groundbreaking album of its time. It paved the way for electronic music and hip-hop, also consolidated Hancock as an innovative musician that would go on to influence several other genres of music as well. Dimensions, released in 1964. Another great album featuring Herbie Hancock's innovativeness. The album was an omen of things to come. We see Hancock tapping into his Afro-Cuban musical heritage. Many of the songs here are in the style of his late albums alongside Miles Davis. He recorded this album shortly before he joined Davis' group. The songs in this album are very hypnotic Latin jazz songs. Succotash is a song that's part dance-themed and part about food and drink and fine dining. Triangle is a very frenetic piece, full of great rhythms and swings and shuffles. Hancock's piano style here was inspired by Duke Ellington, and yet he brings a new flavor to that style. His playing is cool and breezy. Probably the best instance of it is in the song Mimosa, where he plays a beautiful solo. These weren't original compositions. A lot of the songs are completely improvised, leading for a great abstract compilation of music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Herbie Hancock, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending festival news. The Rochester International Jazz Festival, one of the world's leading jazz festivals, is back for its 22nd edition. They have just announced their lineup for 2025. There's a wide range of jazz styles on offer, from classic jazz to bebop to swing to groove and more. Also, there's going to be several performances of great covers of songs from the Great American Songbook. It's said to be a week-long festival scheduled to run from June 20th to June 28th. The festival features more than 285 shows at 18 venues with more than 1,700 artists from all over the world. Every year, around 200,000 people are drawn to the concert, also including jazz workshops and jam sessions. This year on the lineup, there's world-class artists performing, like Smokey Robinson, the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, the Wood Brothers, Ricky Lee Jones, Thundercat and more. There's 3 types of tickets available, for headliner shows, club pass tickets and free shows. The Club Pass series features all kinds of shows from classic to bebop to swing and more. To purchase tickets for the show, please visit rochesterjazz.com. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Herbie Hancock's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Herbie Hancock, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Taking Off. This was Hancock's debut album and showcases innovative takes on existing jazz classics. For example, his cover of the classic Watermelon Man, which went on to become his signature song. He's also backed by a series of rising stars, from trumpeter Freddie Hubbard to saxophonist Dexter Gordon. It's also a great hard bop album. Another album called Empyrean Isles. This one's another unconventional hard bop album. The album spans bop, soul jazz and avant-garde jazz. The songs are based on a mythical island called the Empyrean Isles and are original compositions by Hancock. Each song was intended to bring out a different aspect of Hancock's music. An album called Maiden Voyage. This one's a less adventurous album than Empyrean Isles, nevertheless it's very creative. It's one of his best albums from the 60s, spanning lyrical jazz and hard bop. Also, there's influences of Miles Davis style in the music. There's 5 compositions by Hancock featuring great solos and harmonies. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. The first one's called Taking Off, released in 1962. This one was Herbie Hancock's debut album, and it was a great album even back in his early days. The album showcased not just his virtuoso as a pianist but also a composer. Herbie Hancock was a child prodigy. At the age of 11, he'd been performing with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He'd also worked alongside Donald Byrd, Freddie Hubbard and other jazz greats. Also released a series of albums alongside Art Blakey. Dexter Gordon was a saxophonist for this album, and he was just re-emerging into the spotlight at the time of this album release. He'd taken a break from jazz, and upon his release, he produced some great music. Many of his performances on this album are one example. The lineup was completed by veteran drummer Billy Higgins and renowned bassist Butch Warren. The album starts off with the song Watermelon Man. The song was composed by Hancock and went on to become a classic in later years. The song was inspired by his memories of a watermelon seller who he'd seen traveling outside his home in Chicago. The piece is a gospel-themed song and features 2 great solos by Hubbard and Gordon. Hancock's infectious piano groove sets the stage for the wind instrumentals. Empty Pocketless is a bluesy song that shows off each player's individual skills. Hancock sets the stage with some funky grooves and soulful solos, while Gordon and Hubbard display their blues talents. Another beautiful piece called Alone and I, this one's a romantic ballad. Dexter's very emotional playing sets the nostalgic ambience of the song. Hancock delves deep into the listener's soul with his heartfelt soloing on the keyboard. The album blends blues, gospel and hard bop themes. The compositions and great chemistry between the players provide for a great dynamic listening experience. Upon release, this album topped the charts and shone the spotlight on Hancock's new approach to the music. Another album called Empyrean Isles, released in 1960. This was one of the most versatile albums that Hancock produced under Blue Note Records. The album includes everything from soul jazz to avant-garde styles and showcased Hancock as an up-and-coming star. The album is a popular hit, as well as from a technical viewpoint. It's got many great features like unique rhythmic repetition and angular melodies. So the concept of this album was a mythical place called the Empyrean Isles. The tracks on the album were intended to bring out a different side of Hancock's musical psyche. One of the standout tracks from the album is the song Cantaloupe Island. This one's a peppy soul jazz groove with a gentle vibe. It incorporates blues and dance themes. The song is also famous for its great piano melodies. The song's been covered several times ever since by numerous jazz artists and is a classic today. Another great song, in line with the adventurous theme of the album, is the song Egg. The song features some great rhythms and trumpet playing. Also features some great improvisation. So this album was one of Hancock's early successors, with its beautiful blend of modal jazz and funk and free improvisation. And an album called Maiden Voyage, released in 1966. Another great album. It features the trumpet playing of trumpet virtuoso Freddie Hubbard and the tenor saxophone playing of George Coleman, 2 of the best jazz musicians of that era. Hancock was a great solo artist and composer as is seen on this album. Also a great keyboardist. So there's 5 very long tracks on this album and all of them were composed by Hancock. His intention was to bring out the many moods of the ocean, its grace and turbulence, and the effect it has on mankind. The title track is basically about a coast at dawn. Hubbard's playing is very sensitive and nostalgic. On the song I, he is very vigorous with Ron Carter on bass in the background. Little One is a slower piece with lively drumming by Williams. And Dolphin Dance is a beautiful waltz with great drum solos by Williams. The compositions are great, and so is the improvisation on the tracks that really bring out the flavor of the compositions. Herbie's got a great solo on the song Survival of the Fittest. Also some very imaginative solo performances from trumpeter Freddie Hubbard. There's a driving rhythm section by Ron Carter on bass and Tony Williams on drums. Overall an album that's part modern jazz and part avant-garde. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Herbie Hancock, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were discussing on this program. Herbie Hancock is a jazz pianist and composer. His music is based on rock, soul and jazz. He started out performing alongside the Miles Davis Quintet, where he helped shape the post-bop sound of that era. In later years, he became one of the pioneers of the use of electronic synthesizers in jazz. Many of his songs span several genres and have had a wide appeal. So that was some insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's a composition called Headhunters. The album spent 42 weeks on the Billboard charts upon release and became his first ever platinum-selling jazz album. The themes in this album span funk, soul and R&B. Another album called Taking Off. This was Hancock's debut album and showcases his innovative takes on existing jazz classics. For example, his cover of the classic Watermelon Man, which went on to become one of his signature songs. He's also backed by a series of rising stars from trumpeter Freddie Hubbard to saxophonist Dexter Gordon. It's also a great hard bop album. Another album called Empyrean Isles. This one's another unconventional hard bop album. The album spans bop, soul jazz and avant-garde jazz. Each song was intended to bring out a different aspect of Hancock's music. Also, in 1980, Hancock made history with a composition called Rocket. This song is famous for its innovative sound and its influence on music. This one combines jazz and electronic music. So that was some insight into everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. And on that note, we've come to an end of this week's episode of the program. Don't forget you can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.